All right, hi everybody. This is Mike Raftery here, and welcome to first of a few different webinars that we got going. So we have, pull it up. Oops, there we go. All right. So welcome. This is a series of webinars that we have here at SCM Connections. We have everybody from is joining right now. We've got a really large crowd, which is just awesome. So we're trying to give them a few minutes to filter in here. We'll give it just 1 minute or two. We are going to be recording this, so you will have the ability to share it with your friends and loved ones later. But you're in the right spot if you're looking for the IBP overview and demand planning, where we're specifically looking at transitioning from APO to IBP. So your panelists today are the three people. I don't know if you can, I don't think you can see us, but just see here. If you can see the web screens here, I don't know if you can, but it looks like, let me share. And then we'll go ahead and get started. There we go. All right. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here today. So first off, we have our introductions. Why are we even here? Apparently everybody here is going to be interested in the same thing, which is moving from APO in some instance or form into IBP. So we're going to go through that. We're going to go through the platform in general. And with us today, we have Pat Green and Todd Stenger from SAP, Pat Green from SCM Connections. We'll go through not just the IBP overview, and not just the functionality, because you've seen that before. Odds are you've seen something to do with IBP, you've seen something to do with the platform in general. But we're going to get one level deeper for you in this series of webinars. So today's session, we're not just going to go through the functionality of IBP, but we're going to specifically walk through how you do it, your best practices, what we've learned at SCM Connections over the years that really make the difference when doing that transition. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So with that, quick introductions. We'll go through from top to bottom here. Pat, you want to give a quick overview of your background and qualifications and why you are an expert in IBP?
Sure. So my name is Pat Green. I'm a long-standing supply chain professional. I've worked within the APO space as well as integrated business planning, IBP, in the past like 6 or 7 years. I've done all facets of supply and APO, demand planning, supply network planning, PPDS, and spent a lot of time on the demand planning side, and then kind of the transition to demand within IBP. I've worked in multiple industries across various companies and supply chains, seeing different types of scenarios that and issues that various industries have. Looking forward to the conversation today, and thanks for joining.
Cool. All right, and next we're privileged to have the esteemed expert Todd Stenger from SAP. We've gone way back with Todd since we were, gosh, I don't even know how long ago, long enough that he was kind enough to join us on this webinar. So Todd, you want to give a quick experience of your role at SAP and why you are an expert to be reckoned with?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Todd Stenger. I am a solution manager at SAP, and I have ownership for the demand planning functionality from a supply chain planning perspective. I'm now at 24 years with SAP, and 8 of those were in consulting, implementing APO, and the last 16 or so were in product and solution management.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd. So with that, let's go ahead and get started in our session. So why are we here? So this is sort of the big question. I think everybody's got a massive amount of response to this webinar, which is awesome. And the series of webinars, we're going to do actually 4 of them. And the first one is going to be around demand planning, the conversion specifically around from demand in APO to demand in IBP. The second one is going to be supply planning, specifically how to navigate an S&P or supply network planning implementation to transform it into time series and order-based planning. And then finally, some detailed scheduling and allocation. And then our last webinar is going to be an actual customer testimonial from our friends at McCain Foods, who's made this journey from APO to IBP already, share their lessons learned and what to do. The big thing here, though, is that this is not a technical migration. And if there's one takeaway that you should have in this webinar, it's that this is not a lift and shift. This is not an Office, 365 upgrade. This is not, an update to your phone. This is something that is that is a transformation. And really, what we're looking for is there are processes that you do today. There's processes that your supply chain manages today. And those processes have been improved. They've been kind of right-sized to the right spot within the SAP suite, and the needs have changed. Right now, I think everybody's feeling the pain of supply chain transfer, or supply chain being the constraint at a lot of meetings. You have materials on shipping containers, you have transportation issues, labor issues, component issues. And so those are all things that sort of shift the gravity towards supply chain being a critical part of every organization. And those processes come to the forefront. And what we're going to do is show you how to migrate those from where you're doing it today into an IBP environment. And then finally, we're going to show you the new features as well. There's a lot of new features in IBP that have evolved due to market needs, due to supply chain requirements, and just the overall business in general. So with this, Todd, I think you're most qualified to give us sort of the what is IBP part of the solution. I'm going to kind of give a SAP's take on the application that is first and foremost in supply chain planning.
Sure, thanks, Mike. So I think a lot of you have probably heard of SAP Integrated Business Planning. Really, it's a new application that we have built from the ground up, cloud-based. And our whole goal is kind of, as Mike was talking about, is to support state-of-the-art business processes and allow you to synchronize your planning across all of those processes. And then, we want to leverage that end-to-end visibility and allow you to have faster planning cycles. On the left-hand side is kind of our diagram of the way that we tend to talk about the areas of functionality within IBP. I talk about it as areas of functionality because we do have a construct of a go-to-market construct and a licensing construct that splits integrated business planning into pieces. But it is not, these are not individual things that you would necessarily implement, and they're not separate pieces of software. It is all one model and one piece of software. We just, as with a lot of things cloud, is that you can license just the pieces of it you want to use. You could also start in one place, like demand planning, and then expand out over a 2 or 3 year time horizon if that's what works for your business. And you don't necessarily need to license everything from day one. So these are kind of cloud type concepts. But if you look at the different sort of pieces of the pie that we have, and in this they show as black, we have demand planning functionality. We have inventory optimization. So this is really around where should I have inventory, what my target stock level should be, how should I be buffering for uncertainty on demand and supply. We do it in a multi-echelon methodology that goes across the levels of the supply chain. We now support sales and operations planning processes. So those aggregate, more strategic level processes that you're doing. We also have support for demand-driven replenishment, which is a very different way of running your supply chain, but some customers would like to do that. And so we can certainly have discussions as to whether that fits or not. And then we have what we call response and supply, which is really the supply planning functionality that we have within IBP. Kind of wrapped around this, we talk about supply chain control tower, which is really a lot of the visibility, analytics, and those types of things that we have within the IBP space. This will all integrate with S/4HANA or ECC for those of you who are on ECC. And then, we also have additional planning functionality there, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more in the next slide or two.
I think one thing to point out on this slide, I think, for all the graphics that are out there, what it shows is that it's a singular plan that you're working with. So whether you're running demand, whether you're running inventory, response and supply, that plan being in the middle unlocks a lot of functionality. And when we talk about transforming the process, that's really at the center of it. The ability to have data in the middle shared by all these applications removes batch jobs, overnight runs, transformation tables, all these migration activities that if you have disparate systems exist. those kind of go away, and with that enables a whole new area of functionality that we're going to walk through in the next couple of sessions here.
So a couple other things about the integrated business planning. We talk about having, a new user experience. We have the ability to show better insights and analytics that are part of the foundational pieces of integrated business planning. We also have a flexible and extended data model. I talked about all of these things in one data model. So whether it's demand or supply, your inventory optimization, these aren't separate data models that you then have to pass data between, kind of as Mike said, that helps streamline some of those things. And then we can also work with, down in the bottom, we can also work with things if you're doing your financial planning using SAP Analytics Cloud, we can work with that. For those of you who are using SAP Ariba and part of the business network, we can tie into that as well. Right, but all of the user experience of IBP, as we like to call it, is new. It is either a web UI using Fiori apps, or it is in Excel. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and how that fits to different pieces. But all of this is really the ability to do these real-time scenarios across the entirety of your supply chain is our goal. And you may note, and I believe this is the next slide that we're going to, is that this is a broader set of functionality than what we had in APO. So if you're here saying, well, where do I go from APO? We do have broader functionality per se. Today, we're really talking about demand, and I can talk about, sort of the basic pieces that we have in demand for integrated business planning, right? So, fundamentally, this sounds a lot like things that we've done in the past, right? So we're trying to do a more accurate forecast, any aggregation level for any horizon. We've got a set of statistical models. We have something new called demand sensing, which is a very short-term forecast at a daily level of granularity, which is something that we didn't do in the past. And then on the right-hand side of this are really things that are more platform-based from IBP, in that we have exception management tools, embedded analytics, and then the ability to support what-if analysis. And the what-if analysis we really talk about across the entire supply chain. So just within demand, it's fairly easy to do what-if things in different ways, but the tie-in is with the rest of IBP. We go to the next slide. In the world of kind of the broader spectrum of what do we have in IBP for demand that is not in APO DPs, so we've put together this slide, which is a good reference for you. We don't necessarily need to go through all of it right now, but I'll point out a couple of things. I did talk about demand sensing. That's probably one of the biggest things that we have that's new. We have additional statistical forecasting models and get into things where much more causal models and machine learning techniques. We have more automation around time series analysis and segmentation. We've got a standard way of doing forecast accuracy, which you may want to adapt and also expand for your use. And then the other big one that is really demand focused is driver-based planning, which is a broader set of functionality to do things like promotions for consumer products companies or larger drivers that might impact your S&OP plan. So that could be external, factors that are coming into play, competitor activities, those types of things. All of those can be modeled. And then again, kind of like the last slide, is that the rest of these things on usability, simulation, embedded analytics, these are all kind of part of IBP in general, not specific to demand, but they all help support the demand planning process.
Yeah, and I think they're all kind of come together in terms of just an overall capability and collaboration, right? You're doing these things faster. Our users that after they've converted find that the tasks just take a lot less time. There's a lot less heavy lifting. Data is much more available and ready to process. And so it allows you to take advantage of this new functionality in a way that might be more cumbersome in the past. That's a big driver. One thing just to mention too, from housekeeping point of view, we've muted everybody. So if you do have questions for us or comments, go ahead and put those in the questions feature in the GoToWebinar app, and we can address them along the way. So Pat, do you want to go through some of the new areas I think that we have involved here? This is one I think that doesn't quite make the list, but having the ability to share data and collaborate is something that is really overlooked. But once you have it, users really can't get it, would never give it up.
Yeah, and really what we're talking about here is the ability to publish a forecast or any of the data that you're seeing in IBP directly to the web, and it's all native to the IBP functionality because it's a cloud-based tool. So what you're able to do via, browser or mobile device, you can have real-time interface or interaction with your customers or your suppliers, et cetera, if you kind of extend the SAP or the IBP space, and get that real-time integration, publish their forecast as you see it for them, and also, publish additional information. And this is kind of something that you certainly wouldn't have been able to do in APO, and it's a big kind of step forward, just kind of embedded within the tool set. So now you can be a lot more collaborative, and then you can bring in, your customer forecast, your customer demand, as well as any other kind of external sources that you might have. So that's a really kind of key feature that's just, taken for granted within the IBP tool set.
Yeah, and it's a real practical example of taking, that next step, that cloud-based functionality, and giving it a practical use. And it's these kind of things that get you sort of out of your organization and get that collaboration going. This is another one to help get the collaboration going. So in this case, we're showing, a collaborative view of a consensus demand planning process. So we have units, we have revenue side by side. So we have the same values in both operational terms for revenue, in currency. We're bringing in external feeds. So in this case, we have sales data, marketing data, we have an annual operating plan. These could come from your CRM system. They could come from, a BPC or an SAC financial plan. But this really lends itself, again, going back to that process concept, where the process becomes the migration. So you're migrating processes from offline spreadsheets, legacy tool sets, VLOOKUP tables, pivot tables into a singular system. So there's one source of the truth, and all uses the same pricing, the same data, the same baselines to give you the ability to make decisions faster. And that's truly what the migrations business case, in my opinion, lends itself is. We're going to make decisions faster with a higher confidence level to move the organization faster than our competition can, who's still stitching together overnight jobs and spreadsheets. And it's that kind of capability that truly moves people forward in the demand planning platform and in IBP in general.
And I think, Mike, you kind of hit on the one piece that I would say is from a collaboration. I think one of the unsung heroes of IBP is the ability to integrate both your financial plan and get a real rough cut. I mean, this is not a financial reporting tool, but you can get a rough cut view of what your revenue, your profitability, your costs, et cetera, if you were to integrate that into IBP. And that to me is another signal that helps the planners make better, faster, more accurate decisions for their organization as opposed to just kind of looking at the quantities. So to me, that's a key feature kind of coming forward.
Yeah, huge. So those are some of the new features that Todd mentioned. One big one that he mentioned as well is the demand sensing. And this is sort of a new concept for a lot of people. Pat, do you want to kind of go through where demand sensing fits in the overall demand planning landscape?
Yeah, sure. So really demand sensing is all about, and Todd, you can kind of jump in here because I know this is a little bit close for your baby. But demand sensing fits that gap between the executional demand and forecasting that very short term in I will call it your tactical or your midterm planning. So demand sensing kind of does that short week and gets into the executional layer and taking those inputs, managing those short term inputs that come into your demand plan and then reallocating your forecast for your demand so you get an accurate picture in the short term as market conditions change, right? So this is critical when you're deploying inventory, especially in the short term, to make sure that as those changes come through that you're getting inventory deployed out to the right distribution centers and packaging centers and the fulfillment to make sure that you're hitting your customer service needs. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that one, Todd.
Yeah, just that we're getting into, like you said, much more granular and also much more operational oriented forecasts. And I think the biggest thing with this is just the idea that for many people on the phone that are looking at demand planning, this is not the way your demand planning process is set up. And so there is a lot of change management as to who is going to be working with these numbers. And oftentimes, supply is going to be consuming these numbers, but whether or not you have an actual role within your organization for this. And I think that's a big piece. And certainly partners like SCM Connections can help with some of those discussions.
Yeah, and that's one thing that people think, oh, great. I've read about demand sensing on LinkedIn and I want it. But really, Todd, you hit on something that it's an organizational shift for the data volumes, the horizon that you're focusing on, and how that folds into the overall demand signal. So it's not something, it's something that can be extremely powerful, but it's not something that can be taken lightly. So we have a couple questions on the consensus side real quick. So the question is demand planning part of consensus demand, or is it on top of consensus demand separately from supply planning? So I think if I understand it correctly, how does that consensus view that we displayed fit within the modules of IBP?
Well, first, I wouldn't call them modules because they are not, it's really just areas of functionality. So in the screens that were shown earlier, the consensus demand plan is just another line. If you want to call it demand plan, that's fine. We tend to call it consensus because, generally, you have a statistical forecast and then you have adjustments that are being done. And oftentimes you have some sort of agreement, especially when you get to the S&OP level, you have an agreement on that plan. So it becomes a consensus plan. If you want to just call it a demand plan, that's fine. So there's just a terminology thing there. And then that key figure, so to speak, can simply be read by supply planning. If you want to have that demand plan change on a regular basis and not affect supply planning, we can also set that up if you want to. But that's why I say it's not really modules, in that you don't need to transfer this anywhere. You can have it all in the one planning area, one data model, and you can have your demand just updated. And then whenever you look at supply, you would see the latest in demand. So that's why I like to consider it just sort of areas of functionality.
Yeah, Todd, exactly. I mean, your consensus demand is your input into the supply planning piece of it. So really, if you think from the S&OP process, that's the output of your S&OP process, right? Again, you can update that on a regular basis, but generally coming out of S&OP for the demand review, you would say, this is my consensus demand, and then that's the input to the supply side. Okay.
So what makes demand sensing different? I think this one is kind of lends to that as well. Whereas your statistical forecasting, I think you're using a lot of historical data to forecast future-looking patterns, where demand sensing leans more into pattern recognition. So you're trying to recognize short-term demand fluctuations and specifically outliers before they occur. So you can redeploy inventory, as we were talking about in the supply reaction. So you can reposition components if required. You're trying to get just that extra edge in your short-term demand signal to meet the customer's demand and pick up on these patterns before they become shortfalls. And that's a really key part, that they kind of go together. So if you picture your final demand signal pushed out of IBP, it's really a combined demand signal. You're going to have some sort of horizon that is consensus, maybe statistical, maybe local, maybe annual. But then in that very short term, you're going to also have the demand sensing output. And the two combined will give you the entire demand picture, which you can then pass downstream. So it's very much in line with your entire end-to-end demand flow, but it's looking for different signals, and it's using different algorithms to adjust in the very near term to near-term data signals.
So the other thing I would note is that the question we often get is how does this relate to forecast consumption logic? Because if you think of, if we're changing the forecast in the current week, it fits the same functional space as what many companies are doing today with forecast consumption, and answering questions like, hey, I just got an order for an order for 1,000 units from a customer. Is that this week's demand? Is it just next week's demand pulled in? Is it a special order? What is it? And so what we find is that customers that are looking at demand sensing, it allows them to be much more granular with an algorithmic piece that is not simplistic forecast consumption. And oftentimes companies will essentially turn off forecast consumption or set it to only look at consumption within the current day. As opposed to what a lot of companies are doing today, which may be as long as a month, where they're trying to consume a forecast and figure out what is left of my forecast for the current month. Demand sensing does all those calculations automatically for you based on the historical order patterns. And so it's a much more powerful way of dealing with things like, did I get a special order, or do I expect to get more demand this month? Is this a short-term trend, or is it simply everybody's ordering early because they're taking next week off? As a simplistic example.
And this is just sort of a show of what goes into it, right? So you're taking your consensus plan, but you're also taking all of these other short-term signals, sales order data, point of sales data, which is active now, delivery, shipment, sales orders. So you're trying to, again, recognize patterns before they occur to give you that output into your overall demand flow. So moving on, I think we're going to shift gears now from the solution itself, which we've given you a very high overview of the functional levels. There's a million videos. There's a lot of SAP material out there, SAP webinars that we're going to link to in the notes to help you go very deep on the feature set. Again, there's no shortage of material if you wanted to roll up your sleeves and get into every element of IBP demand planning. What we want to get into in this, and what we're trying to differentiate in this webinar for all of you attendees out there, is that's all well and good, but how do I get from A to Z? How do I get from where I am today, in this case APO demand planning, into an IBP demand solution? What does that process look like? What considerations do I need? What does it really take to get there? Is it a one-for-one, or is it something to be reconsidered?
Right.
So the first slide, again, Todd, I think you guys had provided this one. This is one that shows that it's not a straight line for IBP and how you should think of demand in a post-APO world.
Yeah, from a broad perspective, we use this to talk about the overall APO strategy, right? So in the center of this, we have basically the different areas of functionality you might be using, or different business processes you might be enabling with APO, right? So demand planning, supply network planning. Some of you may be doing service parts planning, which is a little bit of a different discussion. And then on the right side, we've got the production planning, detailed scheduling, global ATP, and then advanced service parts planning. So if we take it at the bottom two, we really have four things that we have to figure out where are these things going. On the left side of the thing, so you have IBP, and you can see that demand and response and supply are basically taking the place of demand planning and supply network planning in APO. So if you are a customer that just uses demand planning in APO, really you're looking at the functionality that you would license with the demand IBP for demand in IBP. If you're using demand planning and supply network planning, you're looking at two things, really, demand and response and supply. On the right-hand side is we made a decision to move these things closer to the execution system. And so those really, the future of those are really becoming more tightly integrated with SAP S/4HANA. And so global ATP becomes something called advanced ATP. And then we have production planning, detailed scheduling, which is basically an add-on to S/4HANA. So the ATP and PPDS become add-ons to S/4HANA. And then all the service parts planning stuff is really going to S/4HANA. So this is kind of the critical thing, is that as a company, the first thing in your transformation strategy is to look at what am I using, and then where am I going, and what am I going to need in order for that to happen. We will talk more about the AATP and PPDS and some of the other pieces of this, but it's just good to know that that's where that's going. And then I'll also just note the other question that we get is from a support perspective, what is when does APO, go quote out of support? And the dates have changed over the last couple of years, but currently APO will be supported through 2027, the end, so it's December 31st, 2027, with standard maintenance. After that, we are offering extended maintenance, and then potentially you could even have customer-specific maintenance. So that maintenance can be extended. It's something you can talk to your SAP account exec about, but it is 2027. One note of caution is that SAP's policy is to support the last 3 releases. Is the terminology we use for APO. That is Enhancement Pack 4 for SCM 7.0. And then, so the last 3 would be Enhancement Packs 2, 3, and 4. If you do look up in the product availability matrix and you look up SCM 7.0, just the base version, it will say that it ends maintenance at the end of 2025, but that's only because of the 3 releases. The majority of you should be on Enhancement Pack 4, but with Enhancement Pack 4, you get all the way to 2027. So.
Thanks, Ted. Yeah, this is something that I think is the first sort of difference to understand. If you're used to doing, for example, APO enhancement pack upgrades that are mostly a technical upgrade with regression and testing, this is not that, right? Your APO transformation strategy should be considered as depending on the scope of your APO implementation, could be a multi-year roadmap for how to migrate and where to migrate these pieces. It is not a straight, release upgrade, for example. It's not like you go from SCM4 to IBP, 2108 or whatever. This is something that needs to be considered. So we're going to be coming back to this concept. It's a little cleaner with demand planning because your demand planning in APO goes to demand planning in IBP. But overall, where does that data go, right? Where does it go in the meantime? Where does it go in the interim? And how do you sort of manage the three phases, right? One is your initial IBP implementation. Then how do you manage it in this sort of interim state where you're half in and half out? And then what does your final state look like? Because one thing that clients need to consider is what moves first, second, and third to remove the most amount of redundant work and to eliminate any sort of wasteful development. And everybody's different, everybody's unique, everybody has a different set of constraints and systems, but it is something that everybody will need to consider as you kick off these sessions. So the next one we're going to talk about is sort of just how these two systems are different. And Pat, I think you have the next couple of slides here where you walk through not just the comparisons of the two, but what to consider and how to manage these differences.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, if you kind of think about APO and IBP as they're compared, really, I mean, you're in a lot of ways, they're very similar from a demand planning perspective. You have, a data structure that is based on key figures. You're doing calculations, and then you're coming up with a demand planning, final consensus demand that gets, normally in the SNP world, it would be released to SNP at a certain point in time. With an APO, you've got, again, if you kind of compare the two, you've got APO has multiple planning areas. You've got demand planning as well as SNP planning or supply network planning, or you could potentially have PPDS in there too. Whereas within IBP, you've got a unified planning area with supply. So, I mean, if you kind of look at those two things, structurally, they're very different, although in the way they kind of behave for the user, they may be quite similar. But the unified planning area with supply allows you to then have one system where your demand signal is very closely aligned with your supply signal. So those all kind of interact. So you're not releasing an order, releasing the forecast and then kind of bringing it down to SNP. So kind of keep that in mind. So they're all within one, and demand can be a separate module, but the unified planning area kind of keeps those all together. Within APO, you've got the CVC-driven planning levels. And what we mean by that is a characteristic value combination determines the level that you can plan at, right? Whereas within IBP, you have multiple planning levels based on your master data attributes, and that allows you to get flexible planning levels so you can kind of make calculations at different levels depending on the need of the business or the calculation for the key figure. So what that allows you to do is aggregate and disaggregate very quickly and more effectively. I don't know, Mike, if you want to kind of, I know you.
Yeah, that's a big one that we get a lot of positive feedback on. In fact, we had one client that had to ask 3 times, are you sure there's no CVCs? Are you sure? Yes, there's no CVCs. Because it does give you the flexibility to react quickly. Same thing with the multiple planning areas, having everything in one planning area. All of these things sort of lean to a more responsive organization where you're able to, develop, share, and compare information in one system. You don't export it to something else where you have a queue built or whatever. It's all in there, and keeping that integrated allows it to align with those supply scenarios, which is the next one, right? It allows it for aggregation logic to be dynamic. It allows side-by-side comparisons in any units. So sort of moving away from those fixed aggregate data structures or characteristic value combinations unlocks a lot of these other elements here in the differences.
Yeah, and I think probably the biggest one we use here is the revenue, using actual pricing for revenue on a very specific basis, and calculating it on the fly and calculating it based at the customer level, and really being able to get that revenue. Because to me, that's a big unlock for IBP. That's where you're able to do that effectively and view not only quantities, which is what the supply chain wants to view, and you also can look at revenue, which is really what the CFO and your the profitability piece of it from your executives they want to look at. So to me, that's a huge one to kind of get all of that integrated within the system. The other thing I was going to kind of note here is the external reporting for analytics support, right? So pulling out and then reporting in BI. With an IBP, because you're using the Excel interface, really it's a embedded analytics, if you will. You get a lot of information quickly and aggregate quickly. So a lot of the reporting needs that you would have from an external system really are mitigated by just the fact of the way the structure of IBP from the aggregation and disaggregation levels. And then obviously you've got, advanced learning capabilities, machine learning and driver-based planning within IBP that's just not available within APO.
Yeah, and that goes to Todd's point. While SAP will support APO, there is not much investment dollars, if any, getting funneled. So you get what you get.
Right.
We had one questions on the CBCs, Pat, around the disaggregation. Can you enter data at an aggregate level and it would prorate at the lowest levels? And yes.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And there's multiple ways to do that, multiple options to do that in your calculations, your disaggregation logic. So yes, absolutely, you can do it, and it's just native in the tool set. Okay.
So that kind of goes well into this one, Pat.
Yeah, and I think the next step, what we really want to talk about is, in kind of the point of this webinar, is really what are the technical topics and what are the things you need to do to migrate from demand planning to IBP. And to me, I think that's not just it's not a one-to-one, like Mike was saying before, it's not a lift and shift. However, there's a lot of concepts specifically within the demand planning area that are very similar within APO. So it's not supply, maybe a little bit more, I would say, complicated than demand is, right? So, and what we're going to talk about for the next, maybe 10 or 15 minutes is kind of some of those pieces that you want to take a look at, some of those things that to make your journey easier, right, and more comprehensive and more complete, and kind of hit some of the big rocks, get those out of the way, so you don't. You can just make your project more effective and more efficient, right? So one of the big things that you kind of have to, the overall infrastructure is the planning object structure. So those of you that are familiar with demand planning, is you have a planning object structure where within IBP you have a demand planning area. So what do I mean by that, right? Demand planning, DP has that's their architecture for the planning object structure. The planning area within IBP, very similar, right? I mean, you would say a planning area within with both systems, but they take a different tack to it, right? So if you look at the main the main component, you'd have characteristics and attributes, right? So how do we get what's coming out of the demand planning tool set? And we're going to assume that you're using demand planning today and you're migrating, right? Taking the characteristic, the CBC calculations and navigational attributes and map those to the master data types within IBP, right? And so one of the key ones here, typically within a demand planning implementation, is the key piece is really looking at your customer definition. Are you doing sold to? Are you doing bill to? Are you doing customer groupings? Are you looking specifically at key customers? Looking at all of those and kind of getting those key navigational attributes and characteristics in place so you can use them and take advantage of them within IBP, and then also mapping them. Now, you'll also have additional IBP master data types that are available that you'll probably want to take advantage of, right? It's easy to add attributes as opposed to a master data type. So a customer can have multiple attributes, and that's much easier to add those attributes and maintain those within IBP, as opposed to having those part of your characteristic value combination structure within demand planning. So that piece of it from the master data side is kind of the key area that you need to kind of focus on and kind of do those mappings. There'll be some things that will go away, and there'll be some things that you want to take advantage of within the IBP space. The other thing, and I kind of put that down here, is your planning level requirements. So when you're in demand planning, you have your planning at a specific level, whether that's the customer or the location or product groups, product families, etc. the infrastructure of using a planning level and how those integrate with the key figures are completely different than it is within IBP. It's different. So understanding from demand planning and APO how you define what level you're planning, your aggregations, how you're creating your forecasts, et cetera, your disaggregations, and then translating those into your planning level requirements for IBP so you can map those, right? And again, we're talking about a migration here. I mean, there will be a lot of new functionality that you want to change coming into IBP. So, don't think of this as a one-to-one mapping, but you really want to say what's effective in your current tool set and map that effectively to IBP, okay? And again, that's going to be kind of the theme of this, right? It's not a one-to-one, but you're going to be taking that over the course of you're going to be looking for functionality to enhance, as well as kind of make sure that the functionality that is working as part of your process is working effectively. Mike, if you can back up to the previous slide.
No, sure. A good place to look for that too is offline spreadsheets, and that's where we go for a lot of requirements. Are there things on people's desktops, or what are you emailing back and forth that you have people whose jobs have not, or whose systems have not kept up with the responsibilities of their jobs. And so instead of this tool delivering a certain requirement, they're doing it offline. And they don't always think of that as a system requirement, especially if you're doing transformation from APO to IBP. But that's important to look at when you're going through these projects, is what are people doing outside the system that you can bring in?
Right. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And those gaps that kind of come out when they download data out of IBP, or sorry, out of demand planning, and then do a bunch of calculations and then copy that key figure into DP. I mean, really, that's kind of a key indicator that something's lacking within demand planning. So the other option, and we'll talk about the time profiles, those are kind of standard, just mapping those. But the key figures, really kind of taking a look at all the key figures that you have, and then understanding what the specific functions of each key figure are, and which ones are redundant, which ones are technical, i.e. you may not need those within IBP going forward, and then which ones are being used as part of calculations. Map the standard key figures, identify and assess and document the gaps you have. Think about your S&OP process, your demand planning process going forward. So this is a good opportunity to do that if you don't have a good solidified demand planning process, and then really kind of take this opportunity to kind of get that integrated. But again, looking at your key figures and mapping those, kind of one of the key elements of your migration path.
And to that end, there was a question if there's standard extractors from APO to IBP. There's not like a upgrade extractor where you're taking data directly and placing it in IBP, but there are ways to do integration to take, say, the results from demand planning and push them back to APO if you want.
Yeah, and typically from a demand planning perspective, you would download that and then load that into, because you're going to have, and we'll get to that in a second, you're going to have data that's coming from APO, your existing adjustments, et cetera. So yeah, I'll kind of get to that in a second. But there's no, in terms of a standard extractor coming from your APO demand planning planning area to, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so the other thing we're going to want to focus on is your demand planning macros. And kind of, you think about a macro, there's really three functions of your macros, right? The formatting macros, which is really looking at how do you format and view something for the users, right? If it's different colors, et cetera. All of those formatting macros will then go to the Excel front end, or the front end GUI. So those kind of go away, right? But some of those things would say, if something's out of alignment, right? You may get a red cell or something along those lines. Those will then move to, the formatting macros will move to the GUI, or the front end GUI within Excel. So those go into a different place. Then you've got the calculations, which is really identifying in, assessing the critical calculations that come up with a forecast, your demand planning forecast. There could be something along the lines of, promotions, or how you're netting things out, or any complex, algorithms that you're kind of creating within your demand planning key figures and macros. So identify, assess, and document those. Say, are you going to use those going forward, and what's the easiest way to get those, and kind of look at the functionality behind it and see if that's something that's going to map to your key figures and your calculations within IBP. And then the other thing is documenting the planning levels for which they're executed. So if you're doing drill down macros, things along those lines, those will get translated specifically to a planning level calculation within IBP, assuming all other things being equal, and you want the same type of functionality and calculations. So it's just going to be a slightly different approach, but defining that and kind of documenting that helps build the calculations for within IBP. And then finally, when we talk about macros, we have alert macros within demand planning. So really, you're going to want to take all of your alert macros, understand them, document them. Why do you use them? What are they being used for? Who's subscribing to them? How they're being managed? And then map those specifically to custom alerts via the web map or the web application within IBP, or you can then have those interactive within the GUI within IBP also. So kind of assess where your macros are coming, your alert macros are coming, and then map those to the proper place within IBP. Okay. And the next one, and this is kind of the big one, and this kind of goes back to the other, what we were talking about before, sales history extraction, mapping, and loading. You're going to have a different CVC structure, and your CVC structure was built for demand planning. You will have a completely different master data structure within IBP, even though it may be similar. So really, that's going to be a big chunk of work to review and determine the source of the historical data, where it's stored in APO, extract it, and load it in an IBP demand system, right, or IBP demand. And really, in this is probably the critical piece, is mapping the CVCs to the IBP master data types, because you could have realigned data, you could have cleansed data, you can go through and make adjustments, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a lot of pieces of information or potential changes that you're going to have to map and cleanse to come in to get a clean signal coming into IBP. So this is a big chunk of work kind of coming in. And we talk about sales history, but there could be forecast history that you're bringing in also, and you'll kind of want to do that in one fell swoop. And then the other thing is really looking at the revenue data in IBP, looking at your determination of how you're going to get your revenue values, et cetera. Are you going to get those from your sales history extract? Are you going to just multiply that by your sales history? You're going to pull that from a revenue statement or the revenue tables within SAP. So that's another piece depending on how far you get along into the revenue side of that. And then finally, that'll be the history, and then you need to go forward and kind of look at your assessment of the APO sales extracts. How you're going to manage it, the sales history loads, open orders, returns, adjustments, all those things that kind of come into the sales history, creating your sales history to create a statistical forecast. So all of that will need to be reviewed, mapped, and then mapped to your IBP master data types. Okay. I know we're getting a little low on time, so I'm going to kind of go through the next one, Mike. And
real quick, there was a question, is there any limit on the number of historical data sources to review, actuals and adjusted history, for example?
I would say there's no real practical limit. There are some, you only have so much data within the cloud. So no real practical limits unless you start getting, I don't know, what are 6, what is it, 6?
Yeah.
Something along those lines of the data. How much you get within the cloud. So no, there's no practical limit, but there is a system limit. Okay. And again, we kind of talk about implementing, demand planning best practices. Make sure you're aligning your S&OP process with your demand planning process. So take the opportunity to look at demand inputs from your different functional areas. If you're not using those within DP and APO, sales and marketing, financial planning, promotions, events, product planning, et cetera. And then kind of think about your consensus forecasting process too. What happens in APO may just be a release. You may have a more complex, more comprehensive consensus demand calculation and process than you would use within demand planning, just because there's more capability and it's a little bit easier to use within IBP.
Exactly, and this is where you look for those spreadsheets, those sort of email-driven processes to look for candidates for functionality to bring into IBP, to make that tool more valuable, and to really re-examine the process. What are we actually doing? It's not just a statistical forecast engine, but it's a demand planning platform.
Right, yep, exactly. And the next thing is, plan to reassess your forecasting models in IBP, right? These models are going to be similar, but have enhanced functionality in IBP. You've got additional models not available. So you've got ARIMA, gradient boosting, SARIMA, et cetera. So some of those take the opportunity, and not only that, you've got better tools with time series analysis within IBP to start really kind of looking at a more comprehensive view of your data to come up with a better statistical forecast model. As well, you know, and kind of we get into the what we do in our projects is we tend to do an analysis, or what we do recommend an analysis to figure out the level using some external tools that we have to determine the level for forecasting at the highest level of accuracy, right? So take the opportunity to kind of assume you're going to do another cut at this coming out of demand planning, and then review and use this opportunity to refine and enhance the models that you're using today. And then finally, your metric definitions, right? Defining the forecast error calculations. There are pretty much all the comprehensive, you know, I would say all the standard forecast error models are available, and calculations are available like out of the box within IBP. So think about how you're going to manage that and creating that using within IBP some of the standard forecast error calculations to create your forecast accuracy, bias, and value add metrics, and think about, you know, those going forward, making sure that those kind of follow along with your process. And then finally, you know, one of the things that we've done, you know, to help kind of, we built out these, you know, within our projects, accelerators and best practices, right? So, I mean, these are some of the things that we have done, and we can help streamline your APO migration by using our, we call it rapid fire project methodology. But essentially, we've taken a lot of the things that we went in the previous slides, documented those in a way to make sure we're asking the right questions, making sure that you're leaning on our learnings over the course of the past 5 or 6 years to make sure that you're getting a better implementation on your front end, right? So, I mean, we do things like APO demand planning, the demand configuration mapping templates, CVCs, the IBP master data types, key figures, planning levels, et cetera. Looking at the transitions for forecast modeling, time series analysis methodology, sales history extracts, et cetera. So, I mean, essentially what this allows you to do is kind of get a jump start on your demand, your DP to IBP migration path.
And while there's no sort of one set process to say you can just put this on autopilot and go from APO demand to IBP demand planning, I mean, there is a standard set of evaluations that are needed, and that's really what this helps enable. It's the framework so that every customer can go ahead and actually understand where they're going to put the functionality from APO or externally or offline spreadsheets into an IBP demand platform. How do we get from A to B? And make sure you don't drop anything along the way. That's critical.
Right, right. And really, this allows us, again, Mike says, don't drop anything along the way. Make sure you're hitting all the, taking the best of what you're doing out of demand planning today, making sure it gets mapped to IBP, and then using additional functionality with an IBP, and knowing when to move to IBP or when to stay with your demand planning DP functionality, and kind of that piece of the process. So,
yeah. So, awesome. Hopefully this, again, just scratched the surface really of the APO to IBP journey. We've got a couple more coming up. The 25th, we are doing APO to IBP supply planning. That's going to cover both time series and order series supply. That's going to be a 90-minute session. Don't miss that one. On the 8th, we're going to do PPDS and GATP, so moving down out of the strategic planning into executional planning. A lot of great detail there. The big one being now we're bringing S4 and future roadmap discussions out into the front of that conversation. And then finally, November 15th, real life customer conversations from McCain Foods, a customer that moved all of their processes from APO to IBP or is finishing up doing it today. They've been running IBP for about 4 years now and have a lot of great experience about what works where and how to do that migration effectively, and we'll have a great conversation with them. And late breaking news, we're going to do in the Southeast an in-person event. So we're going to push this out on social media. This is going to be in your follow-up emails, but for anybody in the Atlanta or Raleigh area, we're going to do 2 events over 2 days, the same event. You don't have to attend both. But to attend those events, right now we have the links up. We'll have all of them sent out in the email. But really looking for that engaged sort of workshop conversation, compare notes with your peers, have discussions with Pat and I will be on site there as well as some others. So some really great sessions coming up. We appreciate all the support we've had from SAP in this endeavor, from our customer friends, from all of our consultants who lended to this these inputs. And hopefully it gave you just a view of how to approach these projects. They are different, and it's not just a technical migration. Hopefully you have a little bit of background on just why now. Pat and Todd, before we sign off, any last minute comments to the group, words of wisdom of what to do in their own projects or how to get started?
I think the only thing I would kind of add is that it's not, you know, if we're certainly on the demand planning side, I think there's a very, things will make a lot of sense on the migration. Technically different, two different tool sets and lots of enhanced functionality, but the baseline demand planning functionality is very similar. So this one's not a huge, demand planning is kind of a good place to start as you begin your IBP journey, because it'll make a lot of sense. And, you know, typically a lot of these processes are ingrained within most organizations.
Todd, anything from your point of view? Oh, he's muted. There he is.
Oh, sorry. I think it's just that, you know, as noted, that this is something that, you know, there is an opportunity to redesign your processes, as well as if you just want to move, you could. But we see a lot of opportunities to do some redesign and rethink things that you're doing as you move from APO to IBP.
Yes, it's definitely a process first project. That's what we find. So with that, we appreciate everybody's time today, especially showing up for a webinar. I know these are not always easy to squeeze in. Have a great rest of the week. We're going to email this out to everybody here in the next day or so with some follow-ups. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to Pat or I. We're easy to find on social media, and we'll attach our emails as well. Other than that, have a great rest of your Monday, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.